Right now, you are conscious. You are aware that you are watching this video. You can think about the fact that you are thinking. You can observe your own observations. But what exactly is this thing we call consciousness? For over a century, psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers have grappled with what William James called the most puzzling problem in all of science. How does subjective experience arise? Why does anything feel like anything at all? Today, we are diving into the deepest mystery of human existence, not to solve it, because consciousness may be unsolvable, but to understand what psychology has discovered about its essence. And what you are about to learn will fundamentally change how you understand yourself and the very nature of your experience. The scientific study of consciousness began with William James in the late 19th century. James, often called the father of American psychology, wrote extensively about consciousness in his masterwork The Principles of Psychology. He made a radical observation that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. Consciousness is not a thing but a process. It flows like a stream, what he called the stream of consciousness. You never have the same conscious experience twice. Each moment of awareness is unique, continuous, yet constantly changing. James argued that consciousness cannot be understood by breaking it down into discrete elements the way you might analyze a chemical compound. It must be studied as a dynamic, integrated whole. But James faced an immediate problem that still haunts consciousness research today. Consciousness is entirely subjective. I can observe your behavior, measure your brain activity, even predict what you will say or do. But I cannot directly access your conscious experience. I cannot feel what you feel or see what you see from your perspective. This creates what philosophers call the problem of other minds. I assume you are conscious because you behave like I do and you have a brain similar to mine. But I cannot prove it. This fundamental privacy of consciousness makes it uniquely difficult to study scientifically. Wilhelm Wundt, who founded the first psychology laboratory in 1879, attempted to solve this through introspection. He trained subjects to carefully observe and report their own conscious experiences under controlled conditions. This approach dominated early psychology until the behaviorists rejected it entirely. John Watson and B.F. Skinner argued that consciousness was unscientific, precisely because it was private and subjective. They claimed psychology should study only observable behavior and ignore consciousness altogether. For decades, consciousness became almost taboo in scientific psychology. But consciousness refused to disappear. In the 1950s and 60s, cognitive psychology emerged and brought mental processes back into legitimate study. Psychologists like George Miller and Ulrich Neisser argued that you could not understand behavior without understanding the internal information processing that produces it. However, they focused on cognitive functions like memory and attention rather than consciousness itself. The question of subjective experience, of what it feels like to be conscious, remained largely unexplored until relatively recent. So, what exactly is consciousness from a psychological perspective? The most basic definition is that consciousness is awareness. This immediately splits into multiple levels and types. There is phenomenal consciousness, the raw subjective experience of sensations, emotions, and perceptions. When you taste coffee, see red, or feel pain, that qualitative experience is phenomenal consciousness. Then there is access consciousness, information that is available for reasoning, verbal report, and guiding behavior. You might be phenomenally conscious of background noise without having access consciousness of it until someone points it out. Carl Jung made crucial distinctions about consciousness that expanded beyond this simple framework. He differentiated between the personal conscious, your ego and everything you are aware of about yourself, and what lies beyond it. Jung argued that consciousness emerges from and floats upon a vast unconscious, like an island in an ocean. Most of your psyche is unconscious, operating outside awareness but profoundly influencing your conscious experience. Dreams, slips of the tongue, emotional reactions you cannot explain, these reveal the unconscious shaping consciousness from beneath. Sigmund Freud had a different model but agreed on the fundamental point. Consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Freud divided the mind into conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. The conscious is what you are aware of right now. The preconscious contains information you can easily bring into consciousness, like your phone number or what you ate yesterday. The unconscious contains material that is actively repressed, kept out of consciousness because it is threatening or unacceptable. Both Jung and Freud recognized that understanding consciousness requires understanding its relationship to what is not conscious. Modern neuroscience has added another layer to this. Antonio Damasio and other researchers distinguish between core and extended consciousness. Core consciousness is the sense of self in the present moment, the feeling of being here now. Extended consciousness includes autobiographical memory, your sense of personal history, and your projection into the future. This extended consciousness is what creates your narrative identity, your story of who you are across time. Animals likely have core consciousness, but may lack extended consciousness. Humans have both, and this dual structure creates our unique form of self-awareness. Now here is where things get truly strange, and you need to pay close attention to this next part because it reveals something profound about what you actually are. Everything you think of as your consciousness, your thoughts, your decisions or sense of being in control, neuroscience suggests it might be arriving to your awareness after the fact. Your brain makes decisions before you consciously know you have decided. The experience of free will might be consciousness narrating actions that have already been set in motion. What does this mean for who you think you are? Stay with me because understanding this transforms everything. Philosopher David Chalmers identified what he called the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, which are not actually easy but are tractable scientifically, involve explaining the mechanisms of consciousness. How does the brain process information, integrate sensory data, produce behavior? These can be studied through neuroscience. The hard problem is explaining why any of this feels like anything. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why are you not just a sophisticated biological robot processing information without any inner life? Multiple theories attempt to answer this. Materialism or physicalism argues that consciousness is nothing but brain activity. When neurons fire in particular patterns, consciousness emerges as a property of that physical process. There is no separate mental substance. Everything about consciousness will eventually be explained by neuroscience. This is the dominant view in contemporary psychology and neuroscience, but it struggles to explain subjective experience. Knowing which neurons fire when you see red does not explain why seeing red feels the way it does. Dualism, most famously proposed by philosopher René Descartes, argues that consciousness is fundamentally different from physical matter. Mind and body are separate substances that somehow interact. This was the common view for centuries but creates its own problem. If consciousness is non-physical, how does it interact with the physical brain? How do thoughts cause behavior? Most modern psychologists reject dualism, but the problem it tried to solve remains. Functionalism takes a different approach. It argues that consciousness is not about what the brain is made of but about what it does. Consciousness is the function of integrating information, making decisions, and producing adaptive behavior. In principle, anything that performs these functions, whether biological neurons or computer circuits, could be conscious. This is the view that underlies much artificial intelligence research, but it also struggles with the hard problem. A computer might process information functionally identical to a human brain, but would it actually feel anything? Carl Jung's perspective offers something different and more psychological. He argued that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of individual brains, but connects to something larger he called the collective unconscious. This contains universal patterns and potentials shared by all humanity. For Jung, individual consciousness is like a wave on the ocean of the collective unconscious. It arises from that larger reality, and remains connected to it. This view treats consciousness as more fundamental than matter, reversing the materialist assumption. Consciousness does not emerge from matter, but matter is known through consciousness. One of the most revealing insights about consciousness comes from studying how radically it can change. Normal waking consciousness feels like the default state, but it is just one configuration among many possibilities. Dreams present a completely different conscious reality where impossible things seem normal, where you can fly or speak with past loved ones without questioning it. Your dreaming consciousness creates an entire world that feels utterly real while you are in it. Meditation systematically alters consciousness in specific ways. Focused attention and meditation narrow consciousness to a single object like the breath, revealing how unstable normal attention actually is. Open monitoring meditation expands consciousness to include everything in awareness without focusing on anything particular. Advanced meditators report states where the boundary between self and world dissolves, where consciousness seems to expand beyond the body. These are not hallucinations but different modes of organizing conscious experience. William James experimented with nitrous oxide and wrote about mystical experiences that convinced him that normal waking consciousness is just one type. He wrote that our normal consciousness is separated by the filmiest of screens from entirely different forms of consciousness. Throughout history, cultures have used various methods to access these altered states, seeing them as valid and sometimes more real than ordinary consciousness. Modern research on psychedelics has confirmed that these substances can produce profound alterations in consciousness, experiences of ego dissolution where the sense of being, the separate self, temporarily disappears. What does this plasticity tell us about consciousness? It reveals that consciousness is not a fixed thing but a flexible process. The way you experience consciousness right now, your sense of being, a unified self-perceiving mind in a stable external world, is the construction. Your brain generates this experience, but it could generate very different experiences under different conditions. The essence of consciousness might be this flexibility itself, this capacity to construct different realities depending on brain state, environment, and intention. Perhaps the most profound question about consciousness concerns its relationship to the self. When you say I am conscious, what is this I that is aware? Most people intuitively believe in a unified, continuous self that persists through time and serves as the subject of experience. But psychological research reveals this self is more fragmented and constructed than it appears. Split brain research by Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry studied patients whose corpus callosum, the connection between brain hemispheres, had been separated. These patients sometimes exhibited two separate streams of consciousness, each hemisphere unaware of what the other knew or experienced. This suggests that the unified self we take for granted depends on brain connectivity. Damage that connectivity and you might get multiple selves in one body. Memory research shows that your sense of continuous identity depends on autobiographical memory, and those memories are constantly being reconstructed rather than accurately retrieved. Every time you remember an event, you are recreating it, and it changes slightly. Your past self is not a fixed reality you access but a story you continually revise. Who you think you were 10 years ago is partly fiction, shaped by current beliefs and motivations. Buddhist psychology, which influenced both Jung and contemporary consciousness researchers, argues that the self is an illusion. What we call the self is actually a process, a stream of constantly changing mental events that the mind mistakes for a stable entity. Meditation practices aim to deconstruct this illusion by revealing that when you look for a self, you find only changing experiences but no experiencer, only thoughts but no thinker. This does not mean you do not exist but that what you are is very different from what you think you are. Jung approached this differently but arrived at similar insights. He distinguished between the ego, your conscious sense of I, and the self, the totality of the psyche including conscious and unconscious. The ego is small and limited. The self is vast and mysterious. Psychological growth involves the ego recognizing it is not the whole story, that consciousness is larger than what you identify with. This process of individuation expands consciousness by integrating previously unconscious material, making you more whole, but also revealing what one calls the self, I, is just a small part of a larger process. So what is the essence of consciousness after over a century of psychological investigation? The honest answer is that we still do not fully know. Consciousness remains the most intimate and immediate aspect of your existence and simultaneously the most mysterious. You cannot doubt that you are conscious, but you cannot fully explain what consciousness is or how it arises. The paradox defines the human condition. We are consciousness trying to understand itself, awareness attempting to grasp the nature of awareness. But here is what psychology has revealed. Consciousness is not a static thing you possess but a dynamic process you participate in. It is not confined to your skull but shaped by your body, your environment, and perhaps dimensions we have not yet mapped. It is far more flexible and constructed than it appears, capable of radical transformations that reveal its essential plasticity. It is intimately connected to, but not identical with the self you think you are. And it might be the most fundamental feature of reality rather than a curious byproduct of matter. The question is not just what is consciousness but what will you do with yours? Because consciousness is not just an object to study. It is the space in which your life unfolds, the medium through which you experience everything. Understanding consciousness is ultimately about understanding the nature of your own existence, the mystery of being you. And that mystery, while never fully solved, can be explored, expanded, and deepened through practices that transform consciousness itself. Psychology has given us maps, but you must make the journey yourself. If this exploration into consciousness expanded your understanding, please remember to hit that like button, share, and subscribe for more journeys into psychology and human nature. Remember, you are not just having conscious experiences. You are consciousness itself, temporarily convinced that you are something separate from the process of experiencing.